I saw her message flicker in the chat box like a slap across the face, mute her. It wasn't directed at me, of course. She typed it to the lawyer, her little private nudge sent without shame, thinking I wouldn't notice, or that I was too slow to read. But I saw it. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. My own sister, trying to silence me in front of everyone, at the reading of our mother's will. The lawyer, flustered as ever, hovered with his cursor over the mute button. For a second, I sat frozen, my hands still on the table, fingers curled around the rim of my teacup. I felt the heat seep into my skin, not from the tea, but from the rush of humiliation that pooled in my chest. My own blood, my sister, wanted me erased from the conversation. That was the message behind those two words. Erased. I clicked unmute before he could, my voice steady though my pulse pounded. I'll read it myself, I said. And I did. The clause that mattered most, the one our mother must have written with me in mind, sat there in plain language, neat and undeniable. I read it aloud, my voice thinner than I wanted, but clear enough. To my eldest daughter, I leave the house and its contents, in acknowledgement of the years of care she has given me. The silence that followed was not the kind of silence that settles gently. It was jagged. It pressed against my ears until I wanted to flinch. My sister's square on the Zoom screen froze for half a second, her mouth twisted as if she'd bitten into something sour. Behind her, I caught a glimpse of her dining room, bright chandelier, wine rack lined with bottles she would never open for me. I waited for her to say something. She always said something. From childhood, she never let a silence stretch without stuffing it full of her voice, her opinion, her laugh. But this time, she typed. The chat box blinked again, that's not what she meant. I almost laughed. Almost. Because what could she possibly mean? It was written in black and white, our mother's words preserved by ink, by the lawyer's files, by the very paper she'd touched. And yet here was my sister, as ever, rewriting the truth so it fit the shape she wanted. I didn't argue. Not yet. I leaned back in my chair and let the lawyer continue, though I barely heard him. His voice washed over me, blurred by the echo of her message. Mute her. The words curled inside me, a command I had resisted by instinct, but one that left its bruise. I thought of all the times she had tried to mute me before. Not with technology, not with a button on a screen, but with that same sharp instinct to diminish. She spoke over me at family dinners. She laughed when I tried to tell stories. She rolled her eyes when I offered an opinion. Even as children, she snatched words from my mouth, spun them into her own, and left me holding silence. And still, I hadn't expected this. Not here. Not now, when the person we both lost was supposed to tether us together, even if just for 1 hour on a Zoom call. I wanted to believe grief might soften her. I was wrong. Grief only sharpened her edges. When the call ended, the lawyer's face dissolving into a polite wave, I stayed at my desk long after the others had logged off. The house around me creaked, old wood shifting as the night cooled. This house, my house now, if words on paper meant anything, felt suddenly heavier, as if it had shifted from my mother's home into mine in a single breath. I set down my tea, now cold, and pressed my palms against the table. It wasn't triumph I felt. It wasn't even relief. It was something rawer, something close to guilt but not quite. I thought of her face, my sister's, that pinched look when she realized the house was not hers to take. I thought of the sting in her pride, the quick calculation she must have been making, all the holidays she hosted, the expensive gifts she paraded, the way she positioned herself as the daughter who mattered most. And yet, at the end, it was me. Why me? I knew the answer, though it sat in my throat like a stone. Because I had been here. Through the long nights, through the slow collapse of our mother's memory, through the clatter of dishes dropped by hands that trembled more each year. I had been here. Not her. But knowledge doesn't quiet the ache of being unwanted. I turned off the laptop, the black screen reflecting my face back at me, tired eyes, deep lines. In the silence, the words echoed again, mute her. I rose and walked into the living room, where the smell of our mother still lingered faintly in the curtains. Lavender soap, the one she always kept tucked in drawers to keep clothes fresh. I pulled one open, lifted a bar wrapped in yellowed paper, and pressed it to my nose. The scent undid me. For a moment I leaned against the chest of drawers, eyes closed, inhaling the ghost of her presence. This house was mine now, yes, but what did that mean, when half of me, the half tethered to my sister, was frayed beyond repair? The days that followed were a blur of phone calls and paperwork. My sister called once, brief and brittle, her voice sharp. "You know she didn't mean it that way," she said, without greeting, without softness. She wasn't herself when she wrote that. She knew exactly what she was doing, I answered. Silence. Then a huff of air, the kind that wasn't quite a laugh. "Of course you'd think that." And she hung up. That was the end of it, at least for then. No more calls. No more messages. Just the wide, echoing silence between us, thicker than before. I filled the hours by sorting through the house. Drawer by drawer, shelf by shelf, I touched the objects she left behind. A chipped teacup. A scarf with threads pulled loose. The worn rosary she kept beside her bed. Each item whispered of her hands, her habits. And with each object, I thought, she wanted me to have this. She wanted me to be the one to carry it forward. Yet even in that reassurance, the sting of betrayal lingered. Not from our mother, never from her, but from the sister who had wanted me silent, erased, removed from the record. The worst part was how familiar it felt. Because when I looked back, I realized this moment hadn't come out of nowhere. It was the culmination of years. Years of being muted in smaller, quieter ways, until finally, she tried to mute me completely. And now, here I was, standing in a house full of echoes, trying to decide what voice I had left. The house became quieter after that first week, not because the creaks faded or the walls stopped sighing, but because I stopped expecting anyone else to fill the silence. My sister didn't call again. Not even a message. It was almost impressive, the speed with which she could withdraw, as though pulling her hand away from a flame she regretted touching. I told myself it was a blessing. Peace, at last. No sharp words, no dismissive laughs, no sly comments dressed as jokes. But the truth is, her silence weighed heavier than her voice ever did. It pressed into the corners of each day, a constant reminder that family is not only what you inherit but what can be withheld. I busied myself with practicalities. That's what grief becomes, eventually, errands and papers. I stood in line at the bank, clutching envelopes thick with forms. I signed my name so many times it lost shape, just loops and slashes across dotted lines. Each signature was a strange mix of affirmation and disbelief. Yes, this house is mine now. Yes, my mother is gone. At night, though, the weight of it pressed harder. I would sit in her armchair, my armchair now, and let the stillness seep in. Sometimes I'd reach for one of her books, the spines worn from years of her hands. She read the same novels over and over, pages marked with faint pencil lines where a phrase had caught her heart. I read those lines as if she were whispering directly to me. And sometimes, it felt like she was. The first Saturday after the will reading, I found myself pacing the kitchen. I hadn't realized how much of my life had revolved around her. Saturdays had always been ours, grocery lists, cooking together, small rituals of shared life. Without her, the day stretched hollow. I stood at the sink, staring out the window at the garden she had tended, now wild with weeds, and felt the ache of loss settle deeper. That was when the phone rang. For a moment, my heart leapt. It might be my sister, calling to bridge the silence. I wiped my hands and answered without checking the screen. It was her, but her voice was not softened. It was sharp, almost rehearsed. "I've spoken to a lawyer," she said, no greeting. "We're contesting the will." The words landed like a blow to the stomach. Contesting. As if our mother's handwriting, her intention, could be rewritten by paperwork and procedure. "You can't," I started, but she cut me off. We can. She wasn't in her right mind when she signed that. Everyone knows it. Everyone? I asked. Or just you? Silence. Then the sound of her breath, quick, uneven. This isn't over, she said, and hung up. I stood with the phone in my hand long after the line went dead. My reflection in the darkened window looked back at me, tired, small, but holding on. Contesting the will. Of course she would. It wasn't enough to mute me once, she wanted to erase me entirely. I didn't cry. Not then. Instead, I poured myself a glass of water and drank it slowly, each swallow grounding me in something my sister couldn't touch. The water was mine. The house was mine. The memories, however tangled, were mine. Still, her threat lingered. I spent the next days in a haze of dread, waiting for letters, calls, official notices. I found myself jumping at the sound of the mail slot. Each envelope felt heavy before I even opened it, as though it carried not paper but judgment. And yet, life insisted on its small rituals. I swept the floors. I boiled eggs. I watered the wilting plants in the living room. Each action was both ordinary and defiant. I am here, I am living, this house is not just walls but proof of presence. One evening, I pulled out an old photo album. Inside, tucked between yellowed pages, was a picture of my sister and me as children. She was 5, I was 7. We stood in the garden, dirt smudged on our cheeks, holding dandelions like trophies. Our mother had written on the back, "My girls, so different, yet both mine." I traced the handwriting with my finger, the loops of the M, the slant of the G. Both mine. The words broke me open. Because that's what I had wanted, all along, not the house, not the inheritance, but the simple truth of belonging. Both mine. I thought of calling my sister then, bridging the silence myself. But the memory of her words, "Mute her, this isn't over," hardened me. To call would be to hand her the power to cut me off again. And I wasn't ready for another wound. Instead, I began to write. Not letters to her, though I drafted a dozen in my head, but notes to myself, scraps of thoughts scribbled on the backs of envelopes, in the margins of newspapers. I wrote about the smell of the garden in spring, about the sound of our mother humming while she cooked, about the sting of my sister's silence. Writing didn't fix anything, but it gave me a voice when hers tried to smother mine. The legal notice came 2 weeks later. A thick envelope, heavy as expected. I opened it at the kitchen table, hands steady though my chest thudded. As I read, the words blurred into legal jargon, phrases I didn't fully grasp. Contesting, capacity, undue influence. My sister's name, bold in print, accusing me of manipulating our mother. Manipulating. The word stabbed deep. Me, who had bathed her, spoon-fed her, sat by her bed through nights of confusion and fear. Me, who had stayed when others left. To call that manipulation was not just false, it was cruelty wrapped in legal formality. I set the papers down and walked outside. The evening air was cool, the sky painted with streaks of pink and orange. I breathed deeply, as if the fading light could steady me. But the ache wouldn't lift. It sat heavy in my chest, thicker with each breath. That night, I dreamt of our mother. She stood in the kitchen, apron tied around her waist, stirring a pot on the stove. She turned, smiled at me, and said, "Don't let them silence you." When I woke, my pillow was damp with tears. The days blurred into each other. Meetings with lawyers, phone calls I dreaded. Each conversation chipped away at me, as if I had to defend not just the will but my very existence, my worth as a daughter. My sister's voice echoed in those rooms, even when she wasn't there, accusing, twisting, muting. Yet amid the noise, small moments grounded me. A neighbor brought over soup, her quiet kindness reminding me I wasn't alone. A letter arrived from an old friend of my mother's, filled with stories of their youth, her laughter, her stubbornness. Each word was a balm, a reminder that my mother was more than the battlefield my sister had turned her into. One evening, while dusting shelves, I found a small box tucked behind books. Inside were letters, my mother's, written to me years ago. Simple notes, reminders to buy milk, encouragement before exams, small scraps of love captured in her hand. One letter, though, caught me. You always stayed, even when it was hard. That matters more than you know. I held the paper to my chest, breath catching. She had seen me. She had known. Whatever my sister tried to claim, these words stood as truth. It was then I realized, this fight wasn't just about the house. It was about my voice, my place, my right to be seen. My sister wanted to erase me, but my mother's words, her real words, not twisted, anchored me. Still, the road ahead loomed heavy. Lawyers, hearings, more silences sharp enough to cut. I wasn't sure how much strength I had left. But I knew this, I would not be muted. Not this time. And that knowledge, fragile as it was, became the seed of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger, not grief, but a quiet kind of resolve. The first court date arrived on a gray morning, the kind of sky that seemed to press down on the world. I ironed a plain blouse, smoothed my skirt, and stood in front of the mirror longer than I meant to. It wasn't vanity that kept me there, it was the weight of being seen. I thought of my sister's words in those legal papers, calling me manipulative, selfish, untrustworthy. I traced the lines on my own face, the tired eyes, the silver threaded in my hair, and wondered if a judge would see what she claimed or what I knew to be true. The courtroom was cold, all sharp edges and polished wood. My sister sat across the aisle, hairpin neat, lips pressed tight. She didn't look at me, not once. It was almost a performance, her gaze fixed straight ahead, as though I no longer existed. Her lawyer spoke first, words tumbling fast, phrases like undue influence and lack of capacity strung together until they sounded less like accusations and more like facts. I wanted to stand up, shout that it was all lies, but my lawyer's hand on my arm kept me seated. When it was our turn, my lawyer's voice was calm, measured. He spoke of my years of care, the doctor's notes, the witnesses who had seen me at my mother's side. He laid out evidence like stepping stones, one after another, steady and sure. But even as he spoke, I could feel the shadow of my sister's accusations hanging in the room. Words, once spoken, have a way of sticking, no matter how false. Afterward, I walked out of the courthouse alone. My sister left through the opposite door, flanked by her lawyer, her heels clicking against the floor like punctuation marks. I thought of following her, of calling her name, of demanding why she had chosen this path. But my voice caught in my throat. I let her go. At home, the silence felt sharper. I brewed tea, the act muscle deep, almost automatic. I held the cup in both hands, letting the heat seep into me. I thought of our mother again, of her voice when she grew frail, soft but certain. You've done enough, love. You've done more than enough. Was that what she had meant when she left me the house? A recognition of enough? Or was it her way of apologizing for the years she let my sister overshadow me, unchecked? The questions wound themselves around me, tightening, and I had no answers. In the days that followed, memories surfaced like stones in the garden after rain. Small moments I had half buried, my sister standing taller at family gatherings, her voice carrying over mine, her stories swallowing my own. Mother's quiet nods, her reluctance to intervene. I used to tell myself she wanted peace, that silence was her way of keeping balance. But now, I wondered if she had seen too much, waited too long, and at the end, tried to correct it the only way she could, by leaving me this house. The house itself began to feel like a witness. Each creak in the floorboards, each shadow on the wall, seemed to murmur fragments of the past. I wandered room to room, touching the walls, tracing the chipped paint, as though the house could answer the questions my mother could not. One afternoon, while sorting through a box of old letters, I found a folded piece of paper I didn't recognize. The handwriting was my mother's, though shaky, written in her final year. It wasn't a letter, it was a note, unfinished, to my daughters. You may not see each other clearly, but I do. I see what was given, and what was taken. I hope one day, the sentence trailed off, the pen mark faint, as if her hand had faltered. I sat with that fragment for hours, reading it again and again. Given, taken. The words echoed. She had seen. She had known. That truth steadied me, even as it broke me open. My sister's accusations could twist and turn, but this scrap of paper, fragile as it was, carried weight no courtroom could erase. Still, the fight continued. Each week brought more papers, more words flung like stones. Some nights, I woke with the taste of them in my mouth, bitter and sharp. And yet, amid the weight, small things began to shift. Neighbors stopped me on the street, asked after me, pressed kind words into my hands like offerings. One brought flowers from her garden, their bright petals startling against the dullness of my days. Another left a basket of apples at my door, no note, just the quiet gift of care. These gestures didn't erase the hurt, but they reminded me of something my sister had forgotten, that belonging is not granted by one person's approval. It grows in the soil of daily kindness, of presence, of witness. One evening, I took a walk through the neighborhood. The air was cool, leaves crunching beneath my shoes. I passed houses lit warm from within, glimpses of families gathered at tables, laughter spilling through windows. For a moment, I felt the ache of exclusion, the sharp reminder that my own sister had chosen to cast me out. But then, as I turned back toward my own house, I felt something steadier. This house, though heavy with loss, was still lit. Still mine. Still waiting. It was not joy I felt. Not yet. But it was a beginning, a thread of something like strength. And in that thread, I recognized the first step toward reclaiming my voice, not in the courtroom, not even in my sister's eyes, but here, in the quiet, where my mother's presence lingered. For years, my sister had muted me in small ways. Now, she had tried to mute me entirely. But in that effort, she had also revealed something I had long overlooked, the depth of my own endurance. I had stayed. I had carried. I had borne witness. And that mattered. As I locked the door that night, turning the key with steady hands, I whispered the words aloud, testing their truth in the air, I am still here. The hearings stretched on longer than I ever thought they would. Each date circled on the calendar felt like a stone in my chest, heavy and immovable. I learned quickly that the law moves slowly, and that silence is not the same as peace. My sister and I sat in the same rooms, breathed the same stale courthouse air, yet we lived in separate worlds. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Not once. It was as though I had become a stranger to her, or worse, someone she had decided no longer existed. At night, I found myself pacing the hallways of the house. The floors creaked beneath me, familiar yet changed. I remembered walking those same halls as a girl, listening to my mother's voice drifting from room to room. Now it was my own voice I heard, faint murmurs as I spoke thoughts aloud just to remind myself I was still here. You belong here, I would whisper. This is yours. But belonging doesn't come easily when someone you love insists you don't deserve it. The accusations hung heavy, not just in the courtroom but in the corners of my mind. Manipulative. Controlling. Unworthy. Words my sister had dressed in legal fabric but that cut deeper than any lawyer's phrasing. Some nights I almost believed her. I would lie awake, replaying moments with our mother, wondering if I had ever pushed too hard, spoken too firmly, assumed too much. Guilt has a way of disguising itself as memory. And yet, even as doubt gnawed at me, the house reminded me of truth. I would open a drawer and find her handwriting on an envelope, saved for later. I would pull out a sweater, its sleeves worn thin by her hands. These weren't artifacts of manipulation. They were threads of a shared life, proof of presence, of care. One afternoon, while sorting through a trunk in the attic, I found a stack of notebooks. My mother's diaries. I hesitated before opening them, afraid of what I might find, afraid she might have written things that confirmed my sister's narrative. But when I finally turned the pages, I found something else entirely. The entries were plain, not polished. Notes about the weather, about meals cooked, about aches in her joints. But scattered throughout were lines that caught my breath. She stayed with me again today. I don't know what I'd do without her. Another entry, she speaks softly when I can't remember. It calms me. And then, I hope she knows I see her. I hope she never feels invisible. I closed the book, tears blurring the ink. My sister could twist words in court, but she couldn't erase these. My mother had seen me. She had known. The next hearing, I carried one of those diaries in my bag. I didn't need to show it, not yet. Just holding it was enough. When my sister's lawyer stood again, painting me as a schemer who had isolated our mother, I touched the worn cover in my lap. Inside those pages was the quiet testimony of a woman who had lived with me, leaned on me, trusted me. That truth gave me breath when the accusations tried to choke it out. Still, the weight grew heavier. My sister became bolder, her voice sharper. At one point she even took the stand herself, her tone dripping with certainty as she recounted a version of events that barely resembled reality. She spoke of me as though I were some distant cousin, a shadowy figure who had swooped in to control and coerce. The venom in her words startled even me. When it was over, I left the courtroom and sat on the courthouse steps, my hands trembling. I wasn't sure if I had the strength to keep going. Then I remembered a line from one of the diaries, she stayed, even when it was hard. I whispered it aloud, the words shaky but grounding. Staying was what I had done, and staying was what I would continue to do. In the weeks between hearings, I tried to reclaim pieces of life. I baked bread, the smell filling the kitchen the way it had when my mother was alive. I walked in the garden, pulling weeds, planting new shoots. Each act was small, but it tethered me to the present. I began to realize that while my sister fought to erase me, I could choose to root myself deeper. There were setbacks, of course. Nights when the silence felt unbearable, when loneliness pressed so tightly against my chest I thought it would crack me open. There were moments when I stared at the phone, tempted to call my sister, to beg her to stop, to remind her we were family. But each time, I remembered the look on her face at the reading of the will, hard, unyielding. She wasn't ready to see me. And I couldn't make her. One evening, I pulled out a scarf of my mother's and draped it around my shoulders. It smelled faintly of lavender, the scent she loved. I stood by the mirror, studying my reflection. The woman who looked back at me was tired, yes, but there was something steadier in her eyes. I thought of all the years I had been muted, talked over, dismissed. And I thought of the moment I unmuted myself at the will reading, my voice carrying my mother's words. That act, small as it seemed, was the beginning of something larger. I began to write again, not just scraps on envelopes but longer entries in a notebook. I wrote about the court hearings, about the weight of silence, about the fragments of love my mother had left me in her diaries. Writing became a kind of defiance, a way to claim my story before anyone else rewrote it. It was during one of those nights of writing that a thought surfaced, clear and sharp. Perhaps this fight was less about winning the house, and more about refusing to be silenced. My sister could contest, accuse, rage, but she could not take my voice unless I gave it up. And I had done that too many times before. Not anymore. The next hearing, I spoke. My lawyer asked me simple questions, but I let my answers carry the weight of truth. I spoke of cooking meals, of late nights sitting by my mother's bed, of gentle words whispered into her confusion. I didn't embellish. I didn't dramatize. I simply told the truth. When I finished, the silence in the courtroom felt different, not jagged, but heavy with something close to respect. My sister wouldn't look at me afterward. Her jaw was tight, her hands clenched. But for the first time, I didn't feel small under her gaze. I felt steady. That night, back at home, I lit a candle on the kitchen table. I sat in the flickering glow, my mother's diary open beside me, and felt something I hadn't in months, calm. The fight wasn't over, not by a long stretch. But for the first time, I trusted that I could endure it. The house creaked, the wind brushed against the windows, and I whispered again, this time with certainty, I am still here. The final stretch of the case felt like walking through thick fog. Each day bled into the next, paperwork piled on the table, court dates etched into the calendar like scars. I lived between two worlds, one inside the courtroom, where words were sharpened into weapons, and the other inside the house, where echoes of my mother softened the edges of my grief. It was on a Tuesday morning, cold and brittle, when the last major hearing was set. I arrived early, my bag heavy with documents, my mother's diary tucked inside as quiet armor. My sister was already there, her expression taut, her lawyer whispering into her ear. She looked polished, perfect as always, hair gleaming, clothes pressed sharp. And yet I saw something flicker in her eyes when she glanced at me, not triumph, not even anger, but something closer to desperation. The judge began. One by one, the lawyers presented their arguments. I heard my life summarized in phrases that felt too thin for their weight: years of caregiving, possible undue influence, capacity questioned, intent contested. Each word chipped at me, but I held steady, my hands resting on the diary in my lap. When it came time for my testimony again, I stood. My voice didn't tremble this time. I spoke of the mornings I spoon-fed our mother oatmeal, of the nights I held her hand while she trembled, of the small moments when she forgot my name but never the comfort of my presence. I told the judge about her humming, her lavender soap, her quiet gratitude. I told him about the note I'd found in her drawer, you always stayed, even when it was hard. As I spoke, I saw my sister shift in her seat. Her jaw tightened, her nails pressed against the table. I realized then that this wasn't just about the house for her. It was about something deeper, perhaps envy, perhaps the years she hadn't stayed, perhaps the guilt she buried under anger. But I couldn't carry her reasons anymore. They were hers, not mine. When I finished, the courtroom was quiet. The kind of quiet that feels full, not empty. The judge nodded, his face unreadable, and called for a recess. Outside in the hallway, my sister cornered me. Her voice was low, sharp. "Do you think this makes you the better daughter?" she hissed. "You think she loved you more? She didn't. You were just convenient. You were there because you had nothing else." The words stung, sharper than I expected. But instead of answering, I looked at her. Really looked. For the first time, I saw the cracks in her anger, the way her hands shook slightly, the way her eyes glistened though she would never let a tear fall. She wasn't just furious. She was wounded. And in her wound, she wanted to wound me too. I took a breath, steadied myself. "I don't think she loved me more," I said quietly. "I think she loved us both. But I stayed. That's all." Her face hardened, but she said nothing more. She turned on her heel and walked away, her heels clicking down the marble floor like gunfire. That night, back at the house, I sat in the living room with the diary open in front of me. I read entry after entry, her words filling the silence. Each one was a reminder that love isn't measured by appearances or performances. It's measured by presence. By staying. I lit another candle and thought of my sister, of her bitterness, of her need to erase me so she wouldn't have to face her absence. For years, I had let her voice drown out mine. But now, for the first time, I didn't need her recognition to feel whole. The next day, the judge delivered his preliminary ruling. The will stood. The house was mine. My sister sat rigid in her chair, her lips pressed thin, her eyes burning. She didn't speak to me afterward. She simply gathered her papers and left. There should have been triumph in that moment. Relief. But what I felt was something quieter, heavier. I thought of our mother, of her hope that we might one day see each other clearly. And I realized that even with the house secured, something had been lost forever, the bond between us, frayed beyond repair. I walked home slowly, the winter air biting at my face. When I stepped inside, the house felt different, not heavier this time, but lighter, as though it had been waiting for this moment. I set my bag down, boiled water for tea, and carried the cup to the armchair. I sat, diary on my lap, steam curling in the air, and let myself breathe. For the first time in months, I wasn't bracing for the next attack. I wasn't waiting for the mail slot to clang with accusations. I wasn't holding my breath for the phone to ring with threats. There was only quiet. And in that quiet, I began to feel the stirrings of something I hadn't known I'd missed: peace. Still, peace came with its shadow. I thought of my sister alone in her polished dining room, her anger still burning. I thought of the little girls we once were, standing in the garden with dandelions in our hands, our mother's voice calling us both hers. And I mourned, not for the house, not even for the fight, but for the loss of the sister I once believed I had. I knew then that resolution wouldn't come from winning or losing. It would come from learning to live with the fracture, from carrying both love and loss in the same breath. It would come from choosing not to be muted, even in grief. That night, I locked the door and stood at the window, looking out at the garden. The air was sharp, the stars faint against the city's glow. I whispered again, this time not just to myself but into the night, as though my mother might hear, I am still here. And for the first time, the words didn't feel like defiance. They felt like truth. The days after the ruling settled into an odd stillness. The kind of silence that isn't empty, but layered, like the pause after a storm, when leaves still drip with rain and branches sag under the weight of what has passed. The house was mine, the papers were signed, but the victory felt hollow. I hadn't wanted to win against my sister. I had wanted her beside me, to share the loss, to share the memories, to share the weight of carrying our mother forward. Instead, I stood alone in the house, the echoes mine alone to tend. I spent those first weeks moving slowly through the rooms. Each drawer I opened, each cupboard I sorted, felt like a conversation with my mother. Her handwriting on recipe cards, her pressed flowers tucked in old books, her half-finished knitting folded neatly in a basket. I touched each thing as though it were her hand, fragile but familiar. Some items I kept. Others I wrapped carefully and donated, whispering a thank you as I let them go. Grief doesn't vanish when the legalities end. If anything, it sharpens. Without hearings and arguments to distract me, I felt the ache more clearly. I woke some mornings expecting to hear her voice in the kitchen, the kettle whistling, her soft humming drifting through the halls. The absence cut deeper than the courtroom ever had. And yet, the house began to feel like mine, not just by law, but by presence. I planted herbs in the kitchen window, their scent filling the air. I opened curtains wide, letting sunlight spill into rooms that had sat too long in shadow. I repaired squeaky hinges, oiled the front door, painted a wall a soft color my mother had always talked about but never chosen. Each act was a conversation with her absence, but also with myself. I am here. I will keep this alive. Letters trickled in from extended family. Some congratulated me gently, others stayed vague, speaking of unfortunate circumstances and hopes for reconciliation. I read each one, then tucked them in a drawer. I didn't have the energy to explain the full story. How could I capture years of being muted, of being erased, in a letter? How could I explain that the fracture wasn't new, only revealed more starkly by grief? My sister didn't call. Not once. Not to argue, not to reconcile, not even to rage. Her silence stretched across weeks, then months, until it hardened into something permanent. Sometimes, I imagined her at her dining table, hosting dinners, raising glasses, weaving stories that didn't include me. Other times, I imagined her alone, bitterness her only company. Both images hurt. There were moments when I ached to bridge the gap. I drafted messages I never sent. I don't want this fight to be the end of us. We both lost her. We're still sisters. But each time, I remembered her words in the courthouse hallway, cutting, unyielding, and I folded the paper, tucked it away. Some doors, once closed, refused to open again. Instead, I leaned into the life unfolding around me. Neighbors stopped by with flowers, pies, small kindnesses. A young family down the street invited me to their barbecue, their children running barefoot in the grass, laughter spilling into the night. For the first time in years, I felt part of something beyond my sister's shadow. Belonging came not from blood, but from kindness. One spring morning, I took a walk through the garden. The weeds had thinned under my tending, new shoots pushing up through the soil. A single rosebush, long neglected, had burst into bloom, deep red flowers heavy with dew. I leaned close, breathing in their scent, and felt a swell of something like hope. This was what my mother had left me, not just walls and rooms, but the chance to keep life growing, even after loss. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with her diaries spread before me. I read slowly, savoring her words. The final entries, written in shaky hand, carried a tenderness that broke me open. She stayed. She stayed. I pressed my palm to the page, tears slipping quietly down my cheeks. Whatever my sister believed, whatever story she told, this was the truth my mother carried. I closed the diary and lit a candle. In its glow, the house felt less empty, as though the walls themselves held memory. I realized then that healing didn't mean forgetting my sister or pretending the fracture didn't exist. It meant choosing to carry both the hurt and the love, without letting one erase the other. Months later, on the anniversary of my mother's passing, I set the table for one. I cooked her favorite stew, laid out her chipped teacup, placed a single rose from the garden in a small vase. I sat alone, but not lonely. I ate slowly, each bite a remembrance, each sip a quiet offering. When I finished, I lifted the cup and whispered, "Thank you for seeing me." Afterward, I stepped onto the porch. The evening air was cool, the sky streaked with fading light. A breeze stirred the trees, carrying the scent of lavender from the drawer I had left open upstairs. I closed my eyes and let the sound of the wind settle into me. I thought of my sister then, not with anger but with sorrow. I knew we might never speak again, that the silence might stretch into years, even into forever. But I also knew this, her choice to mute me no longer defined me. My voice, my presence, my life, they were mine to claim. I whispered into the dusk, words simple but steady, "I am still here." The garden rustled, the candle flickered behind me, and I felt it, not triumph, not victory, but something gentler. A quiet belonging, a rootedness in myself, in this house, in the love my mother had left woven through every corner. The story of us, of sisters, of daughters, of silence and voice, was not neat, not tied with a ribbon. It was fractured, messy, unfinished. But it was real. And in its realness, I found a kind of peace. As the last light slipped from the sky, I turned back into the house. I closed the door softly, the key firm in my hand, and let the quiet hold me. I was still here. And that was enough.